Life after COVID-19, lessons from past pandemics surveys historic epidemics and pandemics of infectious diseases, searching for insight into our future and our lives in the wake of COVID-19. The middle of the 19th century is regarded as the golden age of mapping. Many of the developments in the visual representation of data related to pandemics, epidemics, and infectious diseases. Charles Joseph Minard was a French civil engineer who was fascinated by the visual representation of data. He developed a means of charting the destruction of the Grand Army during the Russian invasion. The x-axis runs from the Niemen River, point 0, to Moscow. The size of the Grand Army is represented by an arrow that proceeds to Moscow in brown and returns to the Niemen in black, the retreat. The width of the arrow delineates the number of personnel surviving in the Grand Army. As is clearly evident, the arrow diminishes on the route to Moscow and further diminishes to almost only a point when the troops, finally, the survivors, return to the Niemen. Now, this is what's known as a flow chart, and it's widely regarded as the first example of a flow chart. Now, turning our attention to cholera, which is again oral fecal, mapping played a key role in the realization that the means of transmission was oral fecal or water, not airborne. For 2,000 years, the humoral theory of medicine, first developed by Hippocrates, held sway. And under that interpretation, a pandemic had to have a universal cause, and that universal cause was tainted air. The theory was known as miasma, and miasma was associated with swamps, areas with poor drainage, abattoirs. Anything that emitted a bad odor was presumed to be bad for human health. In 1849, a British epidemiologist, William Farr, produced a graph linking cholera fatalities to elevation above the Thames in the City of London. The x-axis is the number of casualties. The x-axis is the number of fatalities. The y-axis measures elevation above the River Thames. As the graph clearly indicates, the closer one lived to the Thames in terms of elevation, the higher the fatality rate. And it diminishes to the point that it's almost zero when one is 100 feet above the Thames. Now, the modern mind would make the direct connection to tainted water. far confined by the humoral theory, identified the data, but concluded that it proved that low-lying areas produced noxious odors that caused cholera. Excellent graphic display of data, but he came up a little bit short on the interpretation. However, 5 years later, in 1854, a second physician took a look at cholera in London from a different perspective. Now, John Snow was not an epidemiologist, but he was a celebrity. And as is the case today, apparently that carried considerable weight. Snow was an anesthesiologist, and his claim to fame was that he had anesthetized Queen Victoria for the birth of her last 2 children. Now, Snow was interested in mapping, and he was interested in epidemic disease. He took a look at a particular neighborhood in London that had a severe, concentrated outbreak of cholera, with 2 exceptions. There was a mammoth poorhouse housing 500 inmates in the neighborhood, but it only had a 1% infection rate. There was also a large brewery in the neighborhood where none of the men became affected. There was also a large brewery in the neighborhood. None of the employees became infected. The neighborhood in question shared a single common water pump, except the brewery, requiring vast quantities of water for its product, had its own well. Similarly, the poorhouse, because of its size, had its own well. The neighborhood shared a single common pump, and within 3 feet of it was a cesspit. Snow, on the basis of his map and his celebrity, had the London authorities remove the pump handle. And, not surprisingly, the incidence of cholera immediately dropped significantly in the neighborhood. This map, Snow's celebrity, played a key role in the realization that cholera was waterborne. And in so doing, his mapping undermined a mistaken medical theory that had predominated for 2 centuries.